Platypus, or more formally, the Platypus Affiliated Society. We are a modest international organization focused on the 20th century left, that is the old left of the 20s and 30s, the new left of the 60s and 70s, and the post-political left of the 80s and 90s. We're dedicated to the possibilities of emancipatory politics today, and to this end, we engage on three fronts. We organize reading groups. There's one here at U of H. It meets every Sunday at 1:30 in MD Anderson Library. We also engage in research and journalism through the Platypus Review. We have some issues here. And Platypus Publishing, we have 2 books out. And we do public fora, where we invite leftists of different backgrounds, traditions, perspectives, etc., to participate in spirited, comradely discussion with each other and with you, the audience, the attendees. And that's what we're here to do today. So what was the German Revolution of 1918-1919? We begin with a quote. "The conquest of the governmental power by a hitherto oppressed class, in other words, a political revolution, is accordingly the essential characteristic of social revolution in this narrow sense, in contrast with social reform." That's Karl Kautsky, a member of the First Marxist International and of the SPD. And that's from his 1902 booklet on the social revolution. So in 1918, a revolutionary moment gave rise to an opportunity for seizure of state power in Germany. This task was put on the table for a divided German left that sought to bring about in political form the change that the masses were already demanding in practice. This posed the question of leadership directly. What does it mean to take power? What would revolution in a highly industrialized country entail, especially in relation to the Russian experience that polarized the German left? And how might the left of 2019 be a legacy of such an unresolved moment in left-centric history? How can we politically understand the relationship between reformism, reformists, and opportunism alongside the ideas of revolution? When we think of Russia 1917, Germany 1918, and the failed world socialist revolution of our present, how does the history of the German Revolution inform the 20th century and today about what is considered a social revolution and what is considered a political revolution? So to engage with these questions, we have Bernard Sampson of the CPUSA, Daniel Eisenberg of Platypus, Dewey Nguyen of associate professor here, assistant professor of world cultures and literatures here at University of Houston, and Ryan Booker from Socialist Alternative. So the format is, so first the panelists will give their opening remarks. That's going to be 10 to 12 minutes, opening remarks. Then panelists will have a chance to respond to each other's remarks, 3 to 5 minute responses. And then we're going to open it up to questions from everybody. So that's about it. Let's get started. Whoever wants to start, we can start with you, Bernard, if you like, or we can start, Ryan, if you want to start. Whoever wants to start.
It's better to start on the right and go to the left than it is on the left and go.
Beautiful. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Bernard.
Okay, so I'm speaking particularly not on the whole German Revolution, the Spartacus Uprising, but on the Bavarian Revolution, the state of Bavaria, and the empire of Germany at that time. So first, let me say the subject is more complicated than it seems on the surface. There were actually 2 socialist Bavarian republics. The first led by the Social Democratic Party, and the second one led by the German Communist Party. The first was called the People's State of Bavaria, and the second the Bavarian Soviet Republic. I won't go into the aftermath of World War I or what happened in Germany with the failed uprisings, which I'm sure the other speakers here tonight will cover. Let's begin with November the 8th, 1918, when the People's State of Bavaria was proclaimed during the German Revolution. It led to the fall of the Kingdom of Bavaria within the Weimar Republic. It was led by Kurt Eisner until his assassination by a fascist in February 1919. The People's State of Bavaria then coexisted under the leadership of Jonas Hoffmann with the Bavarian Soviet Republic under Eugene Levine. until May 1919. So first, let's look at how the People's State of Bavaria came into being. The German Revolution of 1918 spread to Munich very quickly. The capitalists and the king were negotiating constitutional reforms, and an agreement was reached on the 2nd of November 1918. They included proportional representation and the transformation of the constitutional government into a parliamentary monarchy. But this was not to be. Starting on November the 3rd, 1918, protests began being organized by the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, calling for peace and the release of detained leaders. On November the 7th, 1918, Kurt Eisner led 60,000 protesters to the army barracks and demanded the abdication of the Bavarian king, Ludwig III, and proposed the formation of workers' and soldiers' councils. The soldiers joined in, and 100,000 people marched to the palace. That very night, the king fled. He was the first monarch of the German Empire to be deposed. The next day, Eisner declared Bavaria a free state. Eisner then became the minister-president of Bavaria. Eisner was part of the revisionist right wing of the Social Democratic Party, which wanted the party to drop its attachment to Marxist ideology. So while he advocated a socialist republic, he did not support the Russian Revolution. In fact, he distanced himself from it. He declared that his government would protect private property rights, and he declared his regime would be a government of kindness, etc. His own cabinet ministers began to turn against him because of mismanagement. The government was unable to provide basic services and soon lost the support of the conservative countryside. Bavaria at this time was overwhelmingly agricultural, and the factories were mostly in Munich and then not a lot. Finally, the socialists were voted out in the January 1919 elections, coming in sixth place with only 3% of the vote. The winner was the Bavarian People's Party, a conservative party, which received 66 seats. While walking to the legislature to hand in his resignation, he was shot dead by a right-wing nationalist. Bernhard Auer, leader of the Social Democrats and Minister of the Interior in Eisner's government, began to eulogize Eisner in the legislature. But there was a false rumor that Auer was behind the assassination, and a member of the Revolutionary Workers' Council, he was a butcher actually, shot Eisner right there in the legislature, seriously wounding him. Then all mayhem broke out. Supporters of Eisner then opened fire, killing a delegate from the Center Party. I believe 2 delegates had heart attacks. It was total mayhem. And effective government in Bavaria quit at that point. A general strike was proclaimed by the soldiers and workers' councils who distributed guns and ammunition. There were demonstrations, kidnappings of aristocrats, etc., attacks on the church. Support for the left grew greatly during this period. For a month, the Central Council under Ernst Neikisch, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, held governmental power. Then on March 1919, a new leader of the Socialist, Jonas Hoffman, an anti-militarist, put together a paramilitary coalition government. This temporary government was overthrown on the 6th of April, 1919. I put a lot of dates in here because everything happened with just the period of about 3 months. Yeah. It was very, very quick. It was very difficult to even keep up. A Bavarian Soviet Republic was proclaimed. The Hoffman government fled to Bamberg in northern Bavaria, where it declared itself the legitimate government. The Communist Party took control in 6 days after the new regime collapsed. The Bavarian Soviet Republic was now headed up by the German communist Eugene Levine. Finally, the new government, unlike the previous, began reforms. First, a Red Army of 20,000 members was formed from the soldiers and factory workers. On April 13th, an attempted coup by the Hoffman government was put down by the new Red Army. 20 died in the fightings. Levine ordered the expropriation of luxury flats and gave them to the homeless. Factories were to be run by workers' councils, and plans were made to abolish money and reform the educational system. But there was never time to see these reforms through. Hoffman and other leaders of the Social Democratic Party in exile began to block food supplies to Munich. They flew planes overhead, dropping propaganda leaflets talking about the perils of Bolshevism. And they began to form a counter-revolutionary army. On the 20th of April, Hoffman's army clashed with the Red Army at Dachau in Upper Bavaria. The Red Army won and Hoffman's army retreated. From April 14th to the 22nd, there was a general strike with the workers in the factories ready to defend the Soviet Republic. Communist Party members, of which there were only around 3,000 in Bavaria, were sent to the most important points. The administration of the city was carried on by the factory councils. The banks were blocked, each withdrawal carefully controlled. The bourgeoisie had disappeared at this point completely. Red Guards began arresting counter-revolutionaries. On the 29th, 1919 of April, 8 men, including a prince, were executed after being found guilty of spying. Friedrich Ebert, president of Germany, began to put together an army made up of 30,000 Freikorps under the command of General von Euwen to take Munich. At Starburg, 30 kilometers southwest of Munich, they murdered 20 unarmed medical orderlies. The Bavarian Soviet issued the following statement: "The White Guards have not yet conquered and are already heaping atrocity upon atrocity. They torture and execute prisoners. They kill the wounded. Don't make the hangman's task easy. Sell your lives dearly." On the 3rd of May, 1919, the Freikorps, numbering 30,000, together with the, quote, White Guards of capitalism, numbering another 9,000, invaded the Bavarian Soviet Republic and defeated the Red Army after bitter street fighting, in which over 1,000 supporters of the Bavarian Soviet Republic were killed. Then about 800 men and women were arrested by the Freikorps and then executed. Levine was arrested on May the 12th and was condemned to death. He was shot by a firing squad on July the 5th, 1919. The Socialist tried to save his life, etc. But I want to read what he said in court. "The proletariat revolution has no need of terror for its aims. It detests and abhors murder. It has no need of these means of struggle, for it fights not individuals but institutions. How then does the struggle arise? Why, having gained power, do we build a Red Army? Because history teaches us that every privileged class has heretofore defended itself by force when its privileges have been endangered. And because we know this, because we do not live in cloud cuckoo land, capitalists would allow themselves to be expropriated, cuckoo land, because we cannot believe the conditions in Bavaria are different, that the Bavarian bourgeoisie and the capitalists would allow themselves to be expropriated without a struggle. We were compelled to arm the workers to defend ourselves against the onslaught of the dispossessed capitalists. We communists are all dead men on leave. Of this I am fully aware. I do not know if you will extend my leave or whether I shall have to join Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. In any case, I await your verdict with composure and inner serenity, for I know that whatever your verdict, events cannot be stopped. Pronounce your verdict if you deem it proper. I have only striven to foil your attempt to stain my political activity. The name of the Soviet Republic with which I feel myself so closely bound up, and the good name of the workers of Munich. They and I together with them, we have all of us tried to the best of our knowledge and conscience to do our duty toward the communist world revolution. So that basically ends it.
I just have some short opening remarks. I wanted to start off by making a distinction between history and the past, because they often get conflated. The past just means everything that has been, but we don't directly comprehend everything, in a sense. We literally cannot. Rather, we understand and produce history, but this is not everything that has been. It's a construction. We receive the past like a frayed bundle of 1,000 hairs that has to then be braided up to make any sense. How then is this possible? If Karl Marx was correct that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness, then the key to how history is braided is the present. For example, anthropologists refer to early civilization as hunter-gatherers. They project a gendered division of labor onto past civilization. But this is not a thought mistake. It's rather a reflection of the present. We find what is the same about the present and the past. History is therefore a relation of current practices with past practices. If these practices change, then so does history. History is historical. This is what it means to say that history is the history of the reproduction of practices. The pieces of history that appear to fit is because they are expressions of the present. We look for fascism in the German Revolution. We look for the Social Democrats and the Communists. It is not uncommon to hear a hard sectarian today yell from the audience, "Bernie Sanders killed Rosa Luxemburg." From the most recent form of injustice, a steady light reflects back on the history as a whole, wrote Theodor Adorno in 1942. The German Revolution returns then in the present because people are still unfree. But this creates a potential problem. If Hegel was right that humanity repeats a moment in order to sanction its necessity, so that Napoleon was defeated twice, that the Bourbons were dethroned twice, and if Marx said that this repetition described by Hegel becomes under capitalism farcical, that is, once as a tragedy, then as a farce, then every time the memory of the German Revolution returns is just as much an opportunity to justify its defeat and regress below its potential. We are the products of the counter-revolution, and therefore necessarily relate to this history through the counter-revolution. There is no pure thought. There is no way out of this, even if we each feel that we are somehow not subject to this. We look at the German Revolution from 2019, but this also means it's filtered through the rest of the 20th century, through 1968, through 1933, through 1989, through 1945, and even through 2016, which I guess is the 21st century. Hence, when we talk about the German Revolution today, if we say something along the lines of, well, that's how history went, then we actually identify with the counter-revolution. So I want to raise a challenge, that we critique the history. By this, I do not mean that it is bad, not criticism, but critique in the Rousseau, the Kant, the Hegel, the Marx sense. What are the conditions? What are the reasons for this history? The real issue is why 1918, 1919, or whatever year is reached for at all. One doesn't just say Rosa Luxemburg was murdered by the Freikorps, but they add an additional, a proto-fascist group. The 1930s weigh on us. The 1960s make Rosa Luxemburg the principal democratic Cassandra of the revolution. So they like to quote, "The victory of the Spartacus League comes not at the beginning, but at the end of the revolution." Or there's another thing you can find on Google Images. "Freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently." Right? So a picture of Luxemburg and that quote next to it. These are favorite phrases of the New Left and their progeny, the Generation X and Millennial Marxists. They look for the spontaneity and democratic principles of Luxemburg against the authoritarian and hierarchical Lenin. It's from this that different lessons of this defeat of the revolution are taken. On the one hand, the German Revolution, the lesson appears to be that it's a failure to recognize the true enemy. The communists downplayed the role of the fascists, considering the social democrats worse, so social fascists. It was only through the fascists coming to power that we learned of the need to make temporary collaborations with progressive parts of the bourgeoisie. The justification is the defeat of the Nazis in the 20th century. So we've learned a lesson, or hopefully, we can look to something to learn a lesson. But this slips something in. The fascists didn't have to happen. They didn't have to come to power. And so as a result, it identifies fascism as a progressive force in history. Other lessons say that the SPD never wanted to overthrow capitalism. So today, young activists make a note to say that they are communists and not social democrats. This is wrong, and in fact projects post-World War II democracy onto earlier history. After all, the social democratic parties, so the SPD, for example, at this time, said that the proletariat was in power, and that to make war on them was therefore counter-revolutionary. So they called Bolshevism not communism, but the militarism of loafers. Furthermore, it unconsciously transports into something we do not have now, a period of multiple internationals for socialism, a second, a third, and a 2.5 international. As a result, social democrat and communists really just come to be stand-ins for democrat and really, really democrat. To then say that the German Revolution haunts the present is not to say that one wakes up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat thinking about what happened 100 years ago. No, that would be progress. It haunts the present in the same way that a ghost haunts a house in a cheesy horror film. It frightens a visitor, but they don't know why it exists. They don't know the problem, and so it appears to them as just something else. But we ourselves should be careful about providing answers for describing what the ghost is. Between the day when the above program was formulated, spoke Rosa Luxemburg, and the present hour, there have intervened 70 years of capitalist development, and the historical evolutionary process has brought us back to the standpoint which Marx and Engels had in 1872 abandoned as erroneous in their preface to the Communist Manifesto. At that time, there were excellent reasons for believing that the earlier views had been wrong. The further evolution of capital has, however, resulted in this, that what was an error in 1872 has become a truth today, so that it is our immediate objective to fulfill what Marx and Engels thought they would have had to fulfill in the year 1848. But between that point of development and the beginning in the year 1848, and our views and our immediate tasks, there lies the whole evolution, not only of capitalism, but in addition that of the socialist labor movement. These lines were spoken just 2 weeks before Luxemburg was murdered at the founding conference of the KPD. So they were December 31st, 1918.
7 minutes.
Okay, I'm almost done actually. Even though they had the writings of Marx and Engels, they could not claim to understand what they meant. Rather, they needed to relearn the lesson of 1848 in practice again. They needed to progress all the way back to 1848. They needed to make sense of Marx and Engels again. History was not a straight line. This was not a thought mistake, but because what Marx and Engels had described had become obscured, and it had become obscured under the addition of the socialist labor movement. This contradictory movement was described by Luxemburg in her final hours. So this is her last piece, Order Reigns in Berlin. Because of the contradiction in the early stages of the revolutionary process between the task being sharply posed and the absence of any preconditions to resolve it, so the task and the preconditions are the socialist movement and the contradiction between the goal and the means to it, individual battles of the revolution end in formal defeat. But revolution is the only form of war, and this is another peculiar law of history in which the ultimate victory can be prepared only by a series of defeats. And just as an aside, since I have enough time, the same thing happened to Lenin in 1917 with the State and Revolution. So those words could have been written at any time, but Lenin all of a sudden felt the need to write this book again on the State and Revolution. So this is Lenin's State and Revolution. One can wager that out of every 10,000 persons who have read or heard about the withering away of the state, 9,990 are completely unaware or do not remember that Engels directed his conclusions from that proposition not against anarchists alone. And of the remaining 10, probably 9 do not know the meaning of a free people's state, or why an attack on this slogan means an attack on opportunists. This is how history is written. This is how great revolutionary teaching is imperceptibly falsified and adapted to prevailing Philistinism. Perhaps what we should look for are the waste products and blind spots that have escaped the dialectic. That is, the hairs in the frayed bundle that we don't know how to braid up. Meaning, even we should challenge our identification with the revolutionary heroes and the suffering of the oppressed in the past. That might actually be part of the counter-revolutionary history, is our identification with them. Meaning those features of this revolution that seem obscure, that don't make sense, that even appear irrelevant and specific for those conditions of the time, perhaps should be considered. The irrelevant features of the German Revolution might only reflect the fact that they outstrip our political horizons today. So Rosa Luxemburg, writing in 1903, wrote, "It is not true that Marx no longer suffices for our needs. On the contrary, our needs are not yet adequate for the utilization of Marx's ideas. The same can be said of the German and Russian revolutions, and of the radicals of the First through the Fourth Internationals. The horizons of those movements today outstrip the present, and their most radical features maybe appear to our day-to-day lives as irrelevant, or no longer adequate, or that we've progressed on them, etc. So, to end, to paraphrase the famous ancient philosopher, I know that I don't know about the German Revolution. So, we'll just
So I'm not an expert on the German Revolution or anything related to Germany, except perhaps on certain aspects of Karl Marx's theory of capitalism. But I wanted to participate in this panel because I'm interested in the idea of council democracy, of which Rosa Luxemburg, one of the leaders of the German Revolution, was a prominent proponent. And the book that I'm finishing right now actually sort of looks at this program that was an attempt to establish a form of council democracy in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So what I want to do today is kind of just speak very broadly about the history of council democracy. So the Workers' Council, that were the inspiration for councilism, constituted a new social form that emerged spontaneously and almost always outside of revolutionary party organizations in virtually every major revolution in the 19th and 20th century. So during the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson proposed what he called the system of elementary republics, which is a sort of confederation of self-governing councils as an alternative to representative democracy. And this system, in which political deliberation would take place at town hall meetings, was designed to promote direct democratic engagement in the political process while preserving the economic independence of farmers against industrial capitalism and finance. During the French Revolution, autonomous councils like the Société Populaire were created in cities like Nantes, and of course at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the Paris Commune was established in 1871. And likewise, during the Russian Revolution, the workers' councils or Soviets emerged as a development that was largely unanticipated by the leadership of the Communist Party. So this history of the council as a political form, however, has been largely neglected within the revolutionary tradition. In orthodox Marxism, the workers' councils or Soviets were often regarded as a sort of transitional stage in the revolutionary struggle to establish a communist state and essentially planned economy. Because the Russian Soviets, for example, were each of them a small power structure of their own. They were viewed by the Bolsheviks, who would eventually dissolve them, as a danger to the centralized state power. Thus, Lenin, having declared all power to the Soviets, would later sacrifice the new institutions in order to create the massive Soviet state, which Luxemburg described as a night watchman state. So in this way, the Russian Revolution corresponds to what Georges Sorel, the syndicalist Marxist, to his account of the European revolutions of the 19th century, which, quote, attacked the upholders of the authority of the law, but did not seek to suppress that authority because they wished one day to utilize it for their own ends. So all the revolutionary disturbances of the 19th century ended in strengthening the state. So the tendency here that Sorel is describing had already begun with the French Revolution, which, as Alexis de Tocqueville pointed out, ultimately preserved the extensive administrative, security, and police apparatus that had been created by the absolute monarchy, with its centralization, excessive regulation, prisons, and police force. And to these, Napoleon, after the French Revolution, of course, added universal military conscription. For Luxemburg, this tendency toward a strengthening of the state pointed to an underlying complicity between bourgeois democracy and state socialism of the kind that Lenin advocated. And it was also the basis of the opposition on the part of the Spartacus League to the attempt by German Social Democrats to achieve socialism through the mechanisms of the parliamentary state through electoral politics. In contrast to this conventional Marxist tradition, Marx himself, on the other hand, had considered the political form of the council as a means of abolishing the alienation of labor that he believed was the basis of capitalism. So Marx said about the Paris Commune that, quote, the working class government created by the Commune was a political form at last discovered under which to achieve the economic emancipation of labor. This political form, as Marx continues, is one in which the smashed state machinery and its disciplinary apparatus was superseded by a fuller democracy based on directly elected political councils and on the abolition of the standing army, which was replaced by a popular militia. In the Commune, according to Marx, democracy was, quote, transformed from bourgeois to proletarian democracy, from the state into something which is no longer a state proper, the political form of the council. So I think what Marx is getting at here is the ideal of a stateless form of socialism, or you could also say a form of local self-government or direct democracy, as well as a decentralized, non-capitalist form of production, right? So neither market production or production organized top-down by the state. So the abolition of capitalism and the withering of the state. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, so obviously this is a big topic, and I think we've all kind of tried to find a bit of a niche to approach it from. And so I'm going to try to maintain kind of a broad historical focus, but centered a little bit around the question of the Revolutionary Party. The German Revolution is actually surprisingly little known or understood, especially compared to the historic events that surround it. I mentioned to a leftist friend that I was preparing for a panel on the German Revolution, and their response was surprised that there was a revolution in Germany between the world wars. This obscurity belies the importance of what happened in Germany during this period, though. In some ways, the German Revolution is a foil to the Russian Revolution that slightly preceded it, and we can learn some lessons from treating it as such, but this is far too simplistic of a formulation. The German Revolution had the potential to be the fulfillment of the Russian Revolution. Indeed, Lenin and Trotsky viewed the revolution in Germany to be vital to the survival of the Socialist Republic in Russia. Lenin, in fact, wrote that he would trade the Russian Revolution for the success of the revolution in Germany. Instead of its fulfillment, however, the failure of the German Revolution was the downfall of the October Revolution. The proletarian social revolution must necessarily be an international revolution. The failure of the German Revolution was a major factor leading to the concessions of Stalinism and socialism in one country and the resultant degeneration of the worker state in Russia. Further, the failure of the revolution in Germany directly leads to the reaction of fascism and the horrors of Nazism. Fascism was not merely an instrument of capital, but specifically of counter-revolutionary capital, reacting to the rise and ultimate failure of the revolutionary moment. So in a historical context, the German Revolution represents both a foreclosure of revolutionary possibility and a birthplace of the reactionary social movements that shaped the subsequent 20th century. In some ways, though, this conception of the German Revolution as world historic tragedy can serve to obscure the concrete struggles and victories of the German working class. Over and over, the German working class rose to the challenges of their historical moment. The period of 1916 through 1923 saw numerous general strikes, repeatedly paralyzing German capital and the German state. Likewise, the oft-overlooked social movements of the period, particularly the women's movement. Indeed, the October Revolution in Russia and the November Revolution in Germany were the primary factor that ended World War I. The November 1918 revolution in Germany saw through the incomplete tasks of the democratic revolution that persisted from the 19th century. Indeed, given the backwards character of the German political system relative to the social forces in society, the working class was the only force that could complete the democratic revolution. This meant, however, that the German proletariat was inevitably confronted with the question of power. In 1918, and again in 1921, and yet again in 1923, the German working class stood on the brink of power. Victory was within its grasp, but it was betrayed by the very institutions and leaders it had developed. Prior to 1914, the main party of the working class in Germany, the SPD, was the crown jewel of Marxism. It's important to understand that what we now recognize as opportunism and reformism by the German social democracy was not quite so clear-cut at the time. Everybody from Ebert to Bernstein to Kautsky to Luxemburg and Liebknecht were calling themselves Marxists, right? And not unreasonably. Famously, Lenin was so shocked by the SPD's support for war credits in August 1914 that he at first thought it must be an imperialist lie. Indeed, the SPD had built through hard struggle and has been built through hard struggle, and through its old guard represented a direct lineage from Marx and particularly Engels. However, we should also recognize that the opportunist failings of the SPD during the war years and subsequently were not actually a break, but rather a consequence of its development. With the repeal of the exceptional laws in the 1890s, which effectively legalized the SPD, and the expansion of world capitalism in the decades around the turn of the century, a deep strain of revisionism took root within the SPD. This developed partly from the increasing conservatism of party and trade union leaders, who understandably sought to preserve the apparatus of power that had been built. It was also deepened by the fact that the party and trade union leaders had witnessed the failure of the 1905 revolution in Russia and responded by tightening their grip so as to head off such so-called adventurism. Furthermore, the social composition and political structures of the SPD significantly underrepresented the industrial working class. Increasingly, tendencies favoring a national socialist movement, at that time that term was free of implications, obviously, that it would later gain, that reconciled the working class with German capitalism arose, epitomized by figures like Gustav Noske. So while the German social democracy used the language of Marxism, and indeed many of the leaders of the SPD likely genuinely viewed their actions as consistent with Marxism, there were in fact significant concrete differences in perspectives and tactics within the party, which led to conflict between the leadership and the left wing of the SPD in the lead up to World War I. So this left wing of social democracy is critical for us to examine. Various tendencies existed, most famously the group that coalesced as the International Group in 1916, out of which came the Spartacist League and ultimately the German Communist Party, the KPD. This grouping was represented primarily by a newer guard of German social democracy, like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, but also some of the old guard, like Franz Mehring. Mm-hmm. Although their influence was somewhat outsized, numerically the Spartacists were mostly a marginal force. In terms of membership and representation within social democracy prior to the splits and within government after November 1918, the Spartacists were dwarfed by the majority socialists of the SPD, as well as by the USPD, which split or really were expelled from the SPD in 1917. However, over and over during the events of the German Revolution, the question of revolutionary leadership was posed. With the crisis of social democracy in 1914, the Spartacist League could have played a role similar to the Bolsheviks in 1917. It's worth remembering that immediately after the February Revolution in Russia, the Bolsheviks were also a small minority. The Bolsheviks, however, had laid the basis for a revolutionary party more than a decade and a half before the Russian Revolution, when they formed a distinct faction in the RSDLP. In November 1918, the Spartacists found themselves attempting to develop cadre and organize a revolutionary party as the events of the revolution unfolded. This was in part due to an understandable reaction against the centralism that figures like Luxemburg identified as enabling the reformist tendencies within the SPD. What existed within the SPD, however, was not the democratic centralism of the Bolsheviks, but a bureaucratic centralism that consolidated power within the leadership. Furthermore, the dominant conception of proletarian revolution within the German revolutionary left showed little concern for the organizational question for much of its history, emphasizing that the masses would spontaneously develop the organizational forms necessary for a revolutionary moment. Karl Kautsky, referring to the USPD, which included the Spartacists shortly after splitting from the SPD, wrote, "The independents thus deprived themselves of any organizational instrument by which the spontaneous mass actions of the revolution, once begun, could be unified and consolidated into a single political striking force. The frustrating experience of yesterday had blinded the revolutionary leaders of tomorrow." In November 1918, as the German Revolution developed, the question of political power was posed directly to the working class. Sections of the working class did find the organizational form of the workers' and soldiers' councils. This democratic form has been observed over and over again, as Dewey talked about, in times of working class revolutionary ferment, from the Paris Commune of 1871 to the Soviets of the Russian Revolution, revolutionary Spain in the 30s, and even to an extent in France in May 1968. This was in many ways the classic Marxist conception of dual power. Here we encounter a complication, though, for the forms of revolutionary power are not a simple negation of the old forms. The masses express themselves not simply through the democratic form of the councils, but also through the democratic form of the National Assembly. Indeed, the legitimacy of the National Assembly in late 1918 and early 1919 was partly established by the workers' councils, who voted for the formation of the Assembly. Furthermore, the call for a National Assembly had been a traditional part of the program of the German social democracy. Even Engels, during his lifetime, suggested not that this demand was wrong, but only that it did not go far enough. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks had put forward the famous slogan of all power to the Soviets. Looking to this example, the Spartacists and other left groupings refused to work within the National Assembly. Rather, the Spartacists boycotted the assembly, effectively cutting themselves off from the masses of workers. This was a failure of revolutionary perspective. It was partly an attempt to apply a schematic understanding of the October Revolution to the situation in Germany, to apply the tactics of the Bolsheviks rather than the general principles of the October Revolution. The illusions of sections of the working class in the National Assembly could not simply be dismissed. Only on the basis of the struggle for socialism with the revolutionaries alongside the masses could the social situation progress. This led into the events of the so-called Spartacist Week of January 1919. This is somewhat of a misnomer. The Spartacus League was in no position to lead a revolutionary uprising in January 1919. Rather, they were in many ways swept along by sections of the wider working class reacting to the provocation of the SPD government. In this, there were similarities to the July days in Russia in 1917, in which a section of the working class attempted to take power too early, as well as to May 1937 in Barcelona. In July 1917, the Bolsheviks had advised an orderly retreat, and Lenin ultimately went into hiding after the fallout of the July days. In January 1919, however, the Spartacists, while not the motive force for the events, initially stoked the flames. Having done so, however, the Revolutionary Committee that was formed to direct the action failed to act. Rosa Luxemburg had cautioned against ultra-left moves in the direction of putschism, writing days earlier, "The Spartacist League will never take over the government in any other way than through the clear, unambiguous will of the great majority of the proletarian masses in Germany, never otherwise than by virtue of the proletarians' conscious assent to its ideals, goals, and methods of struggle." This was not merely a statement of tactics, but also of concrete reality of the revolutionary situation. Trotsky summed up the situation thusly: Spartacist Week began not in a manner calculated by the party, but in the manner of pressure from the indignant lower ranks. It developed around a question of third-rate importance, that of retaining the office of chief of police, although it was in its tendencies the beginning of a new revolution. Both organizations participating in the leadership, the Spartacus League and the Left Independents, were taken unawares. They went further than they intended, and at the same time did not go through to the end. The failure of the Spartacist Week was followed by the whip of counter-revolution. Within days, Liebknecht and Luxemburg had been murdered at the direction of the Social Democrat Noske. Franz Mehring died 2 weeks later. In March, Luxemburg's close ally, Leo Jogic, was assassinated. The head of the German revolutionary movement was cut off. I don't have any time to get into the events of 1921 or 1923, which are a continuation of 1919, but the theme persists, the necessity of revolutionary leadership during revolutionary moments. And this is subsequently a lesson throughout the 20th century, in 1937 in Spain, in 1968 in France. The Leninist Party is a concrete manifestation of the struggle not just against the bourgeoisie, but also within the broad working class movement. It recognizes the need to win the working class over to a revolutionary perspective as the events of a revolutionary moment play out. In retrospect, the failure of the German Revolution demonstrates the importance of this subjective factor. So I'll go ahead and wrap up there and get to some questions.
Thank you very much. Yes. So now we can open responses of 3 to 5 minute responses between the panelists. So, any panelists have any thoughts on?
You want to go first?
Well, I guess I will. A lot of interesting theoretical and philosophical things were brought up, obviously. Well, you know, I think that, we see things from our own perspective, and we have disagreements, and so there's a lot of different things in the broad sense. You know, sometimes I get the feeling that we're lost, and people say we can't really know history, that we can't do things. But I believe the whole idea of scientific socialism is to see what reality is so that we can change things. And that's what the struggle is really about, and about the truth, what actually exists. There is a truth, and there's not a truth. It's not simply a perspective from the individual. That truth exists, and that's what the scientific method does. And so that, and I think people mix up form and content quite a bit, or don't see it as important. but they're two different things. Everything, you have a content which is primary, and then you have a form which is important, and how you get the content across. And so, I try to be very positive on the ideas of advancing the working class in its interest, and I think it's totally possible. I don't feel that we're lost somewhere and that we're forced to remake the same mistakes constantly. To me, it's very simple. The form always changes because the times change, and etc. But the content doesn't change. As long as we live under capitalism, even though its form changes and it develops, the necessary things that take place haven't changed at all. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the disarming of the state, and the role of the state doesn't change. Its form changes. So it's no different in Germany in 1918 than it is today in this country. The form of struggle changes, but the content and how you achieve that content never changes, and that's where I think people mix things up. On the Soviets and workers' councils, I think that that again there's a content, but the form changes. When workers' councils are set up during a revolutionary situation or a pre-revolutionary situation, they serve a particular purpose, and that's to give power to the working class and to help the working class organize to overthrow the capitalists, their adversaries. But the party plays a special role in this, and without that, without the party, the organization of the advanced working class, nothing could happen. The party is necessary, and it's the workers that make the revolution, but it's the party that leads the revolution. And so in the Soviet Union, for instance, I think when you had your Soviets, after the revolutions, they changed form. Now they became a defensive mechanism not only against the capitalists, but they became a mechanism to help build socialism. And so the form changed, but it was the same content. It's just the primary thing they were doing now was something quite different. And I don't think they were abused or anything else. I think the Soviets in the Soviet Union and other socialist states played a good role. Of course, there were mistakes and stuff made. And then on, the failures of the failure of the German Revolution and what it meant to the Soviet Union, I do agree that it was extremely important that the Soviets, that the revolution worked. But even if the revolution was successful, it would have been crushed by French and British imperialism if the Red Army wasn't able to invade Poland, where the workers weren't ready for a revolution. They were more ready for nationalism because they had been oppressed by the Russians and the Germans, etc., in the past, and I think everyone knew it, and so in a sense the Soviets, the Russians, were forced to do something that was against some of the principles and against the truth of what existed at that time to try to achieve something else. And so I think and what happened to the Soviet Union after the failure of the German Revolution, again, because it was brought up, I want to bring it up, is I don't think you have to have world revolution to have socialism, but you do have to have world revolution to have communism. But socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat takes place in individual states under the conditions that exist, the socio-economic historical conditions that exist within each state. And it's a very difficult thing to do until socialism is able to outproduce capitalism. And for the Soviet Union was not able to do that, not only because of boycotts and everything else, but for other reasons. But China today, I think, is showing a way where we see a change. We see the NEP, in a sense, put together in a new way, in a new form in China, and is taking on world imperialism and capitalism. And I think it points a way for, we still have the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is called undemocratic, by ultra-leftists and by the bourgeoisie, something they have in common on this question, but it is the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the form that the Soviet Union took is the same form the German proletariat would have taken if they had taken state power. And it would always be criticized by others, you know. So I think that reality is what actually happens. And I don't think that there were other things that could happen. What took place in all of these countries are pretty much what socialism is going to look like to some degree or another. There was no alternative. You know, Trotsky could not have won in the Soviet Union, no matter what. It's just no way he could have defeated Stalin. And it's not because Stalin was a better debater or anything, or more brilliant than Trotsky or anything else. The objective conditions for Trotsky's thesis was not there. And the reality of what the working class wanted and what it needed was not represented by this. And this is also true in the German Revolution and in all the revolutions, and what's taking place here in the United States. And that's why we have differences on how to achieve the goal of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Obviously, that's it.
Yeah,
That's it. That's fine.
So I guess in responding to the question about history and to new thing, there's supposed to be a critical aspect to it. In other words, in Luxemburg saying that, why does parts of Marxism appear obscure to us, she's referring to what was happening in the revisionist dispute, where Bernstein looked at what Marx had written and said, well, that looks obsolete, or it looks like it's no longer correct. And she's saying, well, that's actually a function of capitalism, that things become obscure. So I think at one time you said the way that we achieve the content, I think the way, but the forms change. But the way that you achieve the content is through forms. So that actually does change if you're saying it remains the same, but the forms change. That would be something that would be, I guess, contradictory in that point. So the point of saying that, maybe there are things that we don't understand is to say that, A, history didn't have to go the way that it did. And in a lot of ways, this is not running counterfactuals of what if Rosa Luxemburg wasn't killed? What if she had split the party earlier in 1914 or some other time? But rather the way that it tasks the present and the way in which we actually might foreclose on possibilities of politics because we say, well, look, this is what happened and that's what has to happen. So that would be what I would say in terms of history. In terms of councils and Soviets, so this came up as well. I mean, the dual power, I think one of the things that happens today, and this just came out a year ago in the All About the Base, which was something that the Marxist Center had produced, the dual power frequently asked questions, is the dual power now gets treated as like a means, whereas really it was an expression of the contradiction of the revolution. Meaning democratic revolutions become contradictory under capitalism because democracy can be constituted either under labor or capital. And of course capital is labor. So it's one of these things that the fact that you have simultaneously a state power and a Soviet power, you have this dual power, is an expression of the contradiction in the executive, that literally the same thing can be applied in two different ways, right? Right meets right, and Mike decides. So I think what happens today is that people treat the dual power as some kind of community control, and so it's a way that they can justify things that they do in their local community and say, look, we're building towards a 1918 situation, whereas it's more like an expression of, I think Lenin put it, the political immaturity. So it's a lot of democratic forms, it's a lot of non-working class, capitalists are part of it, people that are just students are part of it. But it was just an opportunity. And it was also an opportunity for higher capitalism, meaning there's workers' councils in Germany today, and the workers' councils supported the SPD. They supported the SPD while simultaneously putting demands against the SPD.
You agree?
Okay, I'm fine now.
Let me see. So part of my interest in councils and stuff, though, come out of Marx's sort of manuscripts for Capital, where he talks actually about sort of like Proudhon's scheme for a communist state, though, being a situation not of communism, right, but rather where the state kind of organizes commodity production top down, where it becomes sort of the sole kind of buyer and seller of labor, of commodified labor, right? And so that led me to think that sort of the opposition in between sort of communism and capitalism can't be conceived in terms of, this sort of anarchic system of the market economy versus sort of some kind of centralized commodity production, basically, was what Marx is criticizing, sort of this predominant scheme that actually sort of looks like actually existing socialisms in a lot of cases, right? So I was thinking, back to kind of like pre sort of colonial history in Vietnam. There what you had, though, was sort of this non-capitalist system of decentralized production. Sort of these villages and stuff like that were largely sort of autonomous politically and economically, right? And this is, prior to kind of this type of commodity production that either you can regulate through the market and stuff, though, or through some kind of centralized national agencies, though. So then I think, that's why the notion of sort of council democracy as being a decentralized form of non-capitalist production resonated with me. The other thing that I wanted to bring up, I didn't have time to sort of look into the history to be able to to talk more about this, though, was the strategy of the general strike, right? Like whether sort of changed historical conditions have made that sort of type of strategy no longer possible the way it was in Germany during this period. Because there's been a lot of recent studies that have come out that talked about sort of the dependence of that type of strategy and the kind of centralized sort of forms of industrial production that existed during that period, though that may no longer exist now. Like you could sort of shut down things on this kind of mass scale because of the way production was organized. But I didn't get a chance to kind of look at that. And then I was wondering too if like the way in which sort of the wage labor population in this country sort of has changed since that period in Germany has made that strategy impossible now too, because I feel like maybe there's less of this dynamic of kind of the proletariat, though, and the lumpen proletariat, and more of this sort of like logic of expulsion from the entire wage system, where larger and larger sectors of the American population are simply sort of outside of the proletariat, though, instead of like, so those are things that I thought might be interesting to talk about, if anyone could talk about that sort of more, in a more informed way than I could, but.
Okay. I guess first, on Bernard's point on form versus content, and this idea that history developed in the way that it did and that there weren't other things that could happen, I think this is an overly deterministic view of history, of at least of our role in critiquing history. I don't think that we can separate the content of the present from the forms through which that content developed. And I think that necessarily means that we need to take a more critical view of history. So on this question of the possibility for revolution to spread beyond Russia, I think we have to view that as being contingent in order to understand the subsequent development that occurred, and why I would argue, of course, Bernard and I would disagree on this point, but what I would view as the degeneration of the Russian worker state into a form of degenerated socialism, of bureaucratic socialism. On this question of dual power, I agree a lot with what Danny said there. I think dual power is an expression that arises during the revolutionary moment, when you have kind of the peak of that kind of contradiction between between the social forces. I think it's necessarily different from some notion of base building in the present period. I haven't seen the Marxist Center's article on this, but to me they seem like fundamentally different ideas. I also want to say I think we need to be careful in posing Luxemburg and Lenin against each other. I certainly agree that there are important differences between them, and also that Luxemburg was admittedly critical of the Bolsheviks during the period of the Civil War. But I think it's worth noting that she also talked about not a failure of Bolshevism in Russia during this period, but of social democracy in Europe, viewing the situation in Russia as part of the larger world revolution.
You're at 3.
Okay.
No, you're at 3.
Oh, I'm at 3, okay. On that question, I think there is actually a lot more linking Luxemburg and Lenin than separating them. And I think Luxemburg, especially towards the end of her life, came to agree much more with Lenin on the organizational question than she had previously, which I think is really critical. So lastly, I guess I agree with Dewey. It's an interesting discussion about the decentralization of labor, and especially about the expulsion from the wage system that you talked about. I think that has important implications for Marxists, and there's actually surprisingly little theoretical writing on this topic, given how kind of central it is to the modern situation. So I don't have time to get into that more, and I also don't necessarily have any great answers on that, but I think it's an interesting discussion.
All right. Well, so now we can open it up to questions from anyone, any of the audience. If anybody has any questions? Yes.
Daniel?
Yes.
Okay. And you talk so fast, so I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah.
Paraphrasing, you said something like, to the effect that it's not that Marx's ideas weren't adequate for our needs, but our needs are not yet adequate for the ideas. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I was quoting Rosa Luxemburg
Okay.
at that time. So it was one of these things where the article is called Stagnation and Progress in Marxism, and her point is that Marx and theory can outstrip the present, meaning it can actually make less sense to us, and that is a function of it no longer, being of a different period, as being of the 19th century, but us actually regressing in practice. So I guess the point I was trying to raise in my opening remarks is that it's possible that what seems to make sense and that where we seem to have solutions on things, we should even be careful about it, because there hasn't been something like the German Revolution in 100 years. I mean, there just hasn't been a major revolution in an industrial country in 100 years. I mean, I don't think 1968 was not that. And so, to the extent that it seems like one of the reasons why, I guess you were mentioning this, Ryan, that like this whole moment seems kind of irrelevant or fallen to the wayside. It might mean that like the horizon and the ends of the politics are just absolutely not or haven't been on the agenda for any time recently. And I don't think it's just something that we can just, look at in a positivist sense, because I think this is what you mean by scientific. Like if history is a laboratory and we tried one thing and then we see the results and conduct a new hypothesis, but rather that it's possible that we understand less than in the present. So the reason I was trying to end with I was paraphrasing Socrates, I know I don't know, is to actually try to raise the horizons of what's possible. Maybe what you don't know is, maybe what appears to make a lot of sense is the problem with how we understand history in the present. Because I think in terms of the 20th century, I think the major problem is that there's a sense of progress, or we do know things better now. And that I can only raise that as a way for people to think through things.
Yeah, there's an aspect of that you can find sort of in Marx's kind of method in Capital, right? Like, so what he says basically when he's kind of comparing, the Greeks, why they couldn't come up with the theory of political economy, but Adam Smith could, though, was that they didn't have an economic system that was capitalist, though. Yeah. But once you have a fully developed system, you can develop a science that explains this economy really well. But at that point, you can no longer see outside of it.
Yes.
It's become your entire social universe. So at the very moment when history has become fully capitalistic, though, it kind of blacks out everything else that came before it and may come after it. So in that sense, taking a scientific approach of this is what sort of the reality is, though, ends up kind of forcing you to sort of believe in something in an historical situation that could be transitory.
Right. So, Marx tracks the regression from Adam Smith to Ricardo, because Adam Smith develops property and Ricardo just stops with it. He just starts and he doesn't do a whole thing that Adam Smith did. So from the standpoint of science, the famous thing, if you stand on the shoulders of giants, this is the kind of, I think it's Stephen Hawking or something. Who is it? Oh, it's Newton? Right, so that's an Enlightenment view of progress. It's Voltaire, right, that every generation gets better. And of course, this is the desiderata of what we want today. The issue is that capitalism actually obscures things. And so even the dictatorship of the proletariat, that actually really does have to be discovered again, because it's going to look different, and it's not just merely the same end and you call it something different. But people, it's unclear to people in the present what that would even mean. That's why, this is the Lenin thing of revolutionary consciousness needs to come from without, because it's not immediately apparent. So, in terms of what Marx's big thing was that there was regression in capitalism. And so,
Just the way I would put that is, so he's got this funny section where he's talking about, why didn't Aristotle come up with a theory of value,
Yeah.
right? Well, the thing is, though, the theory of value is the same thing as the fetish for Marx, though. So basically, Aristotle could see through the fetishism of the capitalist sort of economy, but he couldn't come up with a scientific explanation of it because he could see through the fetishism. Whereas sort of political economists, though, just sort of take these forms in capitalism as being sort of natural forms, but because of that, they can come up with a scientific theory of how the system works then. So then science and history in that sense, though, are not sort of, are sort of opposed, though, in that sort of account by Marx. But.
Well, I was just going to add then, as, an organizer and somebody who would consider myself a revolutionary, this is why I think it's dangerous for us to take a kind of schematic view of events like the German Revolution or the October Revolution in Russia and try to map them onto our present situation. I think we lose a great deal in ignoring the subsequent development that occurred out of those events. So of course, there are the general lessons of those events, but I think taking an overly schematic view of these historical events is extremely dangerous for any revolutionary.
I'm kind of thinking to you about the sort of continuity, right, between sort of all these different forms of the modern state, though, right, from the dictatorship to the proletariat to the sort of the absolute monarchy, and then like the post-revolutionary state established in France, right? It's kind of like it seems like it's sort of this continual story, though, where regardless of whether it's a parliamentary democracy or if it's a socialist state, though, they just kind of like preserve all of the new sort of administrative techniques and technologies and stuff, though, from the previous forms. And so I've been thinking about this from the perspective of sort of the states that existed prior to capitalism and stuff like that in East Asia, right? Like these were states that were absolutist. They were, they had sort of imperial courts and emperors and stuff, and they were really they were top down. But they didn't have any of that type of apparatus. There were no prisons and stuff in Vietnam except for like people that like aristocrats that opposed the emperor. There was no police force because the village, though, was largely sort of self-governing, right? And so I guess from that perspective, though, all of these, as Sorel says, right, all these revolutions in the 19th century, sort of regardless of who took power, though, ended up kind of strengthening that state apparatus.
Well, he's repeating Marx, right? So it's the last chapter of the 18th Brumaire that all the revolutions have perfected the state rather than smashing it.
Right.
So the goal is to turn it into a story. So the goal is that all of human history has been the perfecting of the state in order that we can learn that lesson well-burled, old Mel, like the little Marx Shakespeare quote. And so, I mean, it's not just like it would be one thing to just say it's a mistake and people keep forgetting to like smash the state or something, but rather Marx is trying to turn it into a story if there was some necessary lesson to it that people had to learn in order to smash the state.
Well, I'm a little confused, but to me, the real question here, nothing has changed. The state, we've always had the state. We've had different types of states, and they've been a mixture, and we carry the past with us, and we carry it according to national states, as they develop. And so every state is a little bit different in its form. but it still is the same content. It's either controlled by the working class, by the people that are oppressed, or the oppressors, whatever that combination may be. And that's based on the balance of forces within that state. So in China, you have a mixed economy because you have imperialism. In Russia, you had the NEP because of the balance of forces. It was still the dictatorship of the proletariat. And no one says that everything should be the same today as it was in the past, because things have changed. But the content is still there. That has never changed. And there should be no debate about that. The debate is in the forms and how to achieve the dictatorship of the proletariat, and eventually to get rid of the state. But you cannot get rid of the state until you get rid of classes, till you get rid of oppression. And so the socialist state's the final state that begins to disappear after many, many generations. But in the beginning, it's got to be a very strong state, because the people that are dispossessed by that proletarian state will do whatever they can, by whatever means they can, to bring that state down. Whether it's to work back within the party, or work with the objective conditions and people outside the borders to bring it down, like what happened in Eastern Europe, or what's happening, in South America right now. So I don't see it as being a very complicated question. The complication is when you're there in that particular state, how they develop their state. I don't think it's up to American communists to tell Chinese communists how to run their state. I think they're doing a fantastic job. They may make mistakes, but who doesn't? The problem is they're advancing and they're winning. And the same thing, and they're helping the other states, and they're helping build an entire separate economic system that's helping states break away from imperialism, which is the main danger in the world today, and the main danger to achieving socialism in anywhere. So if we want world revolution, we have to fight on a worldwide basis against the main enemy, which is imperialism led by the US. And to me, China is leading that today. And so I think that our role is to support those states that are doing it, and let the people in China decide, how they run things. Same thing's true of Vietnam, North Korea, etc., Cuba, whatever. And to me, it's a very simple stand. The class line is here. You take one side, and it's the other side. And I don't like a lot of things about Maduro, but I know where I stand in the struggle against U.S. imperialism. There's a lot of stuff about Assad I don't like, but I know where I stand against U.S. imperialism, the main enemy. And so, our job here in the United States is to defeat the leader of imperialism in this country. And the real question is, how are we going to do that? What can we learn from the past, from the German Revolution, et cetera? Because you're right, there hasn't been a real revolution like Germany in an industrial country since then, except if you want to talk about what happened after World War II and with the Soviet Union, coming in and liberating these countries from fascism and the systems that they set up. But that was really more of a different type of thing than what we're talking about. But for every action, there's a reaction. I mean, the Bolshevik Revolution led toward fascism, the response on a world stage. And what's happening today with Donald Trump, you're seeing it on a world stage in Brazil and other countries. And when the fall of the Soviet Union took place, you saw the U.S. step into that vacuum. And things are changing. But the basics of what we need to do have never changed. It's very simple. We need to build a revolutionary party. And it needs to be organically part of the masses of the working class, not one that preaches to them. Vanguard Party doesn't mean that you know more than anyone else. It means that you're in the trenches at the very lowest level, raising every organization. And every communist needs, we don't look at, say, this union's bad, so we're going to form a new union. We don't give any turf up to the capitalists, because everything that exists under capitalism is a capitalist type of organization or influenced by it. So we fight everywhere in the trenches to move things forward. And the best thing that capitalists want is for us to disengage from struggle. That's what they want. They want you out of the AFL-CIO so they can continue to control it. They want you out of the churches. They want you out of the civil rights movement. The NAACP, it is what it is. But if communists were in the NAACP, it would be a better organization instead of forming a separate organization. Then you have to fight both. It doesn't even make sense. So I think the struggle is the same. You just can't be too much to the right, and you can't be too much to the left. It's a very narrow road. And
so I think that those remarks kind of make clear to me though what the difference is like between the argument that Danny's making about history and the argument that you're making about history. So it seems like you're insisting that sort of we have to be able to learn from the past. That there's got to be some truth in the past for us to be able to kind of carry on the struggle, right? What Danny was saying is sort of if we're not careful about how we look at the past, right, that we risk sort of like projecting things that exist now, though, and making those things sort of eternal. So we can't change actually like how things are now. And I think a good example of that is actually sort of the state. Though I don't think that the content is always the same, but the form changes, right? So a good example of this, though, is and I hate to bring up East Asia, but that's my area of expertise, right? So the French get to Vietnam, right, and they're like, well, you have a despotic state, you have an emperor, right? And so then they proceed then to impose the rights of man, though, the individual freedom and so forth, though. But that, right, in this sort of roots of reason, ends up kind of leading them to kind of import the entire centralized state apparatus that was established during the French Revolution, though. So in the very attempt to dismantle this sort of despotic state that actually was a pretty weak state, it didn't have all of the means, though, that the French state had to be able to control things, tax people, and so forth. They ended up sort of expanding the state, though, in the very name of freedom, right? And so in that case, because the French couldn't distinguish between their form of the state and what existed, though, in this other society, right, they end up pretty much doing exactly the opposite of what they wanted, though. So I think it is, and the concept of a nation, by the way, is a relatively new concept. I mean, sort of, it can't be older than the 17th century. Like, you have to have sort of, modern schools teaching national history, which didn't exist, though, in much of the world, though, like to have sort of a sense of kind of allegiance to a nation. So I think that, there's got to be some truth out there, but then at the same time, if we're not careful about sort of like projecting categories, though, that exist, though, in our particular historical moment back into the past, we risk not being able to learn those lessons from the past that we need to learn to transform the present, right?
Just one thing, because we should take more questions as well. Just before we do that, obviously we actually do have to go beyond Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky and all these people, and in order to achieve socialism. I guess my point is that it seems like the 20th century is proof that we haven't been learning. That's what I would raise. Like, in other words, Rosa Luxemburg's last thing she writes is, "This is only a defeat if we stop learning." But that was like 100 years ago. And I think there's more proof that actually we haven't been doing the quote-unquote science of learning in that sense, because, she would be horrified to see what is happening today. So, I think history weighs more against the learning than it does against us learning. So I sort of raised that point because people can also learn wrong things. Right? In other words, one of the things Lenin deals with instantly with the German Revolution is people learning from him and learning like one-sided things, right? Like you were mentioning the unions earlier. Well, they saw him split the Second International and they went, oh, so we should just split unions.
Or it's like a situation where at the point in which you finally manage to figure out the lesson you're supposed to learn, though, you apply it and stuff in the present, things have totally changed.
Yes.
And it becomes a farce, like the attempt to repeat history, like by learning this lesson that's already kind of in a context where things are totally different.
Yeah.
Do we have any more?
I
have a question. It's mostly directed at you, Bernard. You mentioned how China is developing communism itself as its own, and we should let them, or as communists or socialists ourselves, we should let them develop their own idea as Chinese communists. I guess the same case could be extended to Venezuela and socialists and communists there. But historically, within the German socialist development, they did a lot of socialist and communist work that then influenced Russia to develop into this socialist and revolutionary, eventually, state. And so there was, in a way, a link between the two countries. you don't think that's the case between American communists, Chinese communists, and Venezuelan communists, that that we shouldn't shy away from having a dialogue between each other, and even self-critique?
No, I'm not going that far. Obviously not. The Chinese Communist Party has delegations that meet with the American Communist Party several times a year, and they discuss different things. They just had this big meeting on Marx, in China, where we had a delegation that went to that, and afterwards met with Chinese leadership. They asked us, they can't figure out Trump. It's a little humorous. They said, "What's up with Trump? We can't figure him out." That's what they told John Bochtel. And what I'm saying is that we shouldn't be overcritical. I think there's one thing, there's a way to do constructive criticism, and too many groups attack other socialist states and say they're revisionist or whatever, and especially when it comes from the U.S. and from U.S. leftists, it's very chauvinistic in my opinion, and it doesn't help people. The Chinese are doing a great job right now, and they've learned. They've gone through different stages under Mao Zedong, under the original stage with cooperation with the Soviet Union, then break with the Soviet Union and a move to ultra-leftism, and back to sort of right-wing revisionism, and now back into what I would call, a Marxist-Leninist approach to building socialism, and building socialism on a world scale. I mean, they do it a little differently than the Soviet Union did. They don't, but even the Soviet Union, for instance, with Turkey, for instance, the Soviet Union defended the Turks against the French and the British and the Balkans, and gave arms and support to the Turks, while at the same time they took the Turkish Communist Party out to the Bosphorus and drowned them. And people criticize China because of its support, say, for other countries that are not socialist by doing economic deals with them. But that's to bring them away from U.S. imperialism, to set them up for a later stage where they can move forward. Because as long as they're under imperialist domination, there'll be absolutely no change. And so the form of struggle is different, but the content hasn't changed. It's still a fight between the working class and the capitalist class. Nothing has changed on that. So I don't, I can, you can always make criticisms about things, but it's more difficult to do when you're not actually there having to deal with the actual problems. We can criticize Rosa Luxemburg, or we can criticize, different revolutions and revolutions that failed, Bela Kun and Hungary. We can criticize, and everyone can see in hindsight what went wrong and perhaps what they could have done to correct it. But it doesn't really serve a purpose, because we're in a new stage of history. Things, but the scientific method means you build on what was done before. In science and physics and everything else, we build. I mean, it was impossible for people in ancient Greece to come up with some of the scientific theories, things we have today, because they didn't have the technology to prove some of the things that they came up with in their minds. And so it's a combination. Again, what our minds come up with and how we developed is based on material conditions and objective conditions. So we're very limited by that. And right now we've seen a huge revolution in technology, and that's going to affect how we develop socialism, how capitalism, and this is where the contradiction of capitalism comes in, because it's going to help them to a point, but only because of profit, and it's going to limit what it can do. In other words, they're putting a stop on science because of profit. They're putting a stop or locking up things that should be given to the public to help increase production and make life better because of the profit system. And hopefully this is where China, especially in these technical fields and stuff, will be able to go past it. The Soviet Union, up to the day it fell, there was a boycott on computers and computer chips and everything else. You couldn't get them. And so the Soviet Union tried to develop miniature tubes and tried other various things, but China is now taking a lead, and it pisses off the U.S. capitalists. They don't like it.
So if imperialism, like in the just standard Lenin definition, was that it was finance and banks and capital, then of course China is imperialist. Because they have plenty of countries that are now on the petro-yuan, right? So it would still have its sphere of influence like anything. The second thing I would say is that when we talk about classes, classes for Marx were forms, meaning he called them character masks. So they were expressions they were actually the way in which we understood things. So you can't just say the content is the same if you're talking about classes, because those are forms. And I think this is what you were getting at earlier. In fact, it might look really different today. Maybe the form of proletariat is no longer sufficient. And so we can say, of course, there's still continuity. This is basically the point of my opening remarks. It's why do people reach for Marx at all? Oh, obviously we still live under unfreedom, right? It might be something different, but the question is to also pick up on the change in the continuity of things. So that was in terms of forms. In terms of a lot of these countries, one of the things that comes out of this German Revolution, the German Revolution doesn't start just because there's a delegitimization of the Kaiser's state. It starts because of the Russian Revolution. In other words, what you were saying, the October Revolution, literally on the anniversary of the October Revolution in a demonstration, this is the beginning of the German Revolution. And one of the first things that Karl Kautsky has to do, because he knows where Lenin and Trotsky and Luxemburg are getting this idea from, is say, no, this is a German revolution, this isn't a proletarian revolution. In other words, one of the things that begins to crop up in this period is people start doing it was an old Menshevik thing, of countries have different conditions. It's easy to demonstrate why countries have different conditions. The point is to demonstrate the continuity, the organic interdependence between countries. In other words, the reason why, England and France have to invade Russia is because their capital is there. And who's that capital going to be upheld by? Is it going to be the English state or is it going to be the Russian state? And if you have the Soviets claiming it, right, it's necessarily an international thing that can't be put into what are the country's conditions in that sense. And so this also raises the point about Venezuela and China and Cuba today, which is how did they raise the necessity of revolution in America? That's the only question that I have for them right there, is to what extent are they necessitating revolution at every second in Chicago and Houston and New York? Because instead I think what happens is to be a good person, you put solidarity for them. And that's fine and everything. I obviously don't want the U.S. sending drone planes against innocent families. But if we're going to talk about socialism and the left and Marxism, then the question regarding them is, how is China raising the necessity of revolution in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think applying this idea of the differing conditions of nations, applying this schema of nations to the question of the revolution, you have to be very careful. That it becomes very superficial very fast. And I think I think in reality, when you think of the October Revolution, it's not a Russian revolution; it's an expression of the broader world revolution. So I'm of course not arguing for some chauvinistic idea that Americans should be telling the working class in China how to carry out a revolution, but I do think that we need to not be contextualizing the social revolution on the basis of the nation state and as developing somehow completely independently within different nations. So on the question of China, we kind of echo what Danny said, which is and add that the mere opposition to U.S. imperialism is not a progression towards socialism. And it does not necessitate the creation of a revolutionary situation anywhere else in the world. In fact, I would argue, we can kind of discuss the character of China at this point, but I think the working class is out of the equation to a significant degree. And that's not, not what I would call socialism in the sense that Marx or Luxemburg or Lenin meant it. And so, when we talk about not projecting, our own, ideas of revolution, or being chauvinistic to take that position, I would argue that our solidarity isn't with the Chinese state; it's with the Chinese working class, and I do not think those things are synonymous right now. So I think it's really critical that we get back to this notion of international proletarian revolution and avoid superficial dichotomies based on nation.
There was a point by Bernard about technology that I want to pick up on too, though. So one of the things that I wanted to look into more was what so in the 1920s apparently, right? Like German industry was much more sort of capital intensive though than England had been, during sort of its period of industrialization, I guess. But I guess because of the higher like organic composition of capital, there was this problem where if the factories had to stop, right, that was a lot of money that was going to waste, though. And so for that reason, during the 20s, I guess, though, the economic situation, or I guess like strikes could be much more effective in terms of really, really hurting capital. So I was wondering if like the situation was the same during the German Revolution, or if it hadn't sort of been industrialized up to that degree at that point.
Well, I can just say one thing, which is the Putsch stopped with a general strike.
Mm-hmm.
So they attempted what would have been a Kornilov revolt in Germany. They stopped it with a general strike.
Right.
Just to answer that, but you want to say?
Well, there's several things that were brought up that I thought was really interesting. On the statement of imperialism not leading toward revolution necessarily, the struggle against imperialism has led to revolutions all over Africa and all over. And Asia. It was the struggle against imperialism that led toward the Vietnamese dictatorship of the proletariat. The struggle against imperialism in China led toward the victory of the communist forces. So, I have to disagree with that. But it is, of course, a little bit more complicated than that. I think that, in the general strike, of course, things have changed. We used to have everybody lived in a working class neighborhood that was around a big factory that had 4,000 or 40,000 people. So it was easier to organize. But today, we don't have those big factories. There's very few of them. So people live in the suburbs and they drive. And so you can't just walk into a working class neighborhood and everyone in that neighborhood works at that factory. They work all over the place. So the content's still the same. The form of struggle is different on how you organize. And there's another thing. General strike would work, but it also has to include the occupation of the buildings. It's not, computers allow people to continue to work. You have to be able to stay in the bank, not just walk out of the bank. You have to stay. You have to stay in the places and begin to operate it and give free food at fast food places to people, whatever it may be. But I think there's that. And China is not imperialist at all. Just because they have capital. Was the Soviet Union imperialist when it was under the NEP? Of course not. It has the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's impossible. That's a Maoist, ultra-left conception that existed about the Soviet Union that led them into the arms of U.S. imperialism and opposing actual liberation struggles around the world, which was a big mistake that luckily they have changed and corrected. So, and you see it today. The capitalist press constantly talks about Chinese imperialism in Africa and everywhere else. But didn't the capitalist press talk about Russian and Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe? This is an old thing. We have to be really careful about this. We're talking about two different things. There's real imperialism, and then there's where the state comes in and actually helps people. And that's what China's doing in Africa. Now, the capitalists, of course, have been exploiting that, and they're trying to bring up all differences. And there are some differences, because China does have some companies which are privately owned. 25%, 75% of the Chinese economy is state-owned. Okay? And when you open up a private company in China, There's certain rules that you have to follow, that the dictatorship and the proletariat makes you. For instance, Walmarts in China are the only unionized Walmarts in the world, for instance. And you have to have a communist cell. And you usually have a cell of 8 members. We have a Chinese comrade at our club here who's studying in Houston, and he told me about how his club operates in the industry as a communist club, and what they do, and how they try to spread Marxist thought among the workers and protect workers against exploitation. And that includes even abuse in a state-owned factory if it need be. But China has done something no other country in the world has done. It's moved hundreds of millions of people in a short time for extreme poverty. It's raised the standard of living. And yes, there's mistakes, but they have more electrical cars than any other country in the world. They're developing a green energy that we can only dream of. They're helping other countries break from U.S. imperialism and European imperialism. They're doing incredible things, and they're building factories and building structures throughout the world, similar to what the Soviet Union did. Not to exploit people, but on very low interest levels. You can't give away anything free, obviously. Nobody can do that and subsist. In fact, the Soviet Union tried to do that when it tried to equalize wages and stuff, and it led toward, lowering of production, because bourgeois relations, economic relations, still exist under socialism for a long time. Just like bourgeois rights, because you still have a state, and your state is not something that's totally new. It still carries the past. It reflects the past and the consciousness that people have and what they did. And so this is why world revolution is necessary to eliminate the threat of capitalism. But until you have that, you have to revolutions take place in individual states. So thank God China is coming into the modern world, and I think what they're doing is good. Let's see. The German Revolution didn't happen because of the Russian Revolution. The German Revolution. Otherwise, you could have said, why would there a revolution in the United States, or why would there a revolution in France, or in England?
That's a good question.
Yeah, the revolution.
No, that is a good.
The revolution happened in Germany. Of course, the Russian Revolution was a stimulus to workers around the world, obviously. But why did it become a revolution in Germany? Because Germany was the major nation that was defeated, totally defeated, and people were tired of the war and everything else, and it was more open to it. Other countries, they had uprisings in Italy, and of course Hungary had a revolution that was successful. And if Soviets were able to have linked up, things might have been a little different to some degree. But
Ryan, did you have a?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, of course, bourgeois social relations persist, beyond a revolution, and I agree that the social relations in China are qualitatively different than in the United States. Of course they are, but I think when we reduce this question of socialism to simply to state ownership, we lose something of the emancipatory character of the socialist project. Which is to say that in China, the social relations are not such that the working class truly controls and directs the product of their labor. You have instead a bureaucratic apparatus that does. So certainly that's qualitatively different than the capitalism of the United States, but it lacks any of the emancipatory content of the social revolution. And on the question of imperialism, I absolutely defend China against U.S. imperialism, just as I would have defended the Soviet Union against U.S. imperialism had I been alive at the time to do so. But I think this question of imposing the imperialism of the United States is not mutually exclusive with also supporting the working class in states like China, like Venezuela, in completing the task of the social revolution, and directly controlling the means of production, as a class, as opposed to through these bureaucratic apparatuses that have, that arose in the Soviet Union, that have arisen in China, which is, I think, qualitatively different from worker control over over the means of production. And then on this question of whether or not the Russian Revolution or the October Revolution caused the German Revolution, of course, I don't want to get into counterfactuals, but I think you can, if you look at the situation in Germany and in Russia at the time, I don't think it's too far out there to say that the German Revolution in November 1918 doesn't happen without the October Revolution. That the October Revolution creates some of the preconditions for revolution in Germany, and that in fact, the developing revolutionary situation in Germany creates some of the preconditions for revolution in Russia in October 1917. So again, I think trying to apply this scheme of separate national revolutions does us a disservice in trying to understand the actual, development of these revolutionary situations.
Any more questions?
I have one, yeah. So bringing it back to 1918, right? It seems like we had a lot of different versions of it, like Bavaria, and then I guess I read some. Is it Hafner? Which emphasized his book on the German Revolution, emphasized
Sebastian Hafner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sebastian Hafner. That basically the powers that be, I guess the Allies, sort of handed. It's actually a general, right? A German general that handed the defeat to the Socialist Party. So I'm trying to piece these things together, and given the vacuousness of our even knowing that there was a revolution in 1918 to begin with, unless you're in this room or something. I guess I'm going to this then, since we've talked about different forms of the way socialism could have been developed through councils and Soviets or something like that. And we have Parliament in the mix of this thing, and their part in the revolution. And then I guess I'm trying to imagine what I am not even aware of, which is the actual street fighting that must have gone on, or who was leading whom. I guess it was a socialist versus a socialist revolution, basically, in Germany. And anyway, if you can. Maybe if you can comment on the actual politics of the thing, or how the governance of it, how the government, the parliament, and the parties were involved with it. And then secondly, if you could suggest, maybe since Germany was so defeated after World War I, maybe do you have an idea about how maybe people should have reversed and set up Soviets and councils, and maybe the wise thing, as Luxemburg, I think, indicated they weren't ready yet, the first Spartacist, revolution, right? So maybe comment on those things. Sorry if that question went on.
I just want to say that this kind of argument that's happening over the causality of the German Revolution, it really is about the horizons of the revolution. Because if it's just something like Germany was defeated, and this is why we kind of had this thing happen, we had a change of power, then the idea that people take from this is that you just wait for a U.S. military defeat and then you get a socialist revolution, right? So this is why you have the Spartacist League today have this position that if ISIS defeats the U.S. in the Middle East, then we're going to get a socialist revolution in the U.S., right? And so the issue there is that, so it's Ludendorff who kind of sets up everything on September 29th. He's using the SPD because of the Bolshevik Revolution. And he says, I'll support you if you stop Bolshevism from coming in. And so it has to do with the horizons then. Because if it's just, it happened because of a military defeat, then the horizons are just a coup to get rid of the Kaiser. Right? But if it had the horizons of the proletarian revolution, which necessarily has to be international, I don't know what else to say. In other words, a worker producing something in Vietnam, they can make a property claim in the US. If they're part of the supply chain, they can say that's my labor. Bourgeois right says so. You know, someone producing a phone in Bangladesh can say that was my labor over there in the US in the iPhone. So there's no other way of adjudicating this but by a global dictatorship of the proletariat. So I think what's happening is that it's over the horizons of what happened in the October Revolution. So maybe this panel should have been called, what was the end of the October Revolution? In other words, you know, was it 1919? Was it 1923? Was it 1989? Right? Was it the fall of the Berlin Wall? Right? Because other people would say, well, no, it didn't end in 1919. It kept going, and then it's 1989. Adorno thinks it ends in 1919. He thinks Luxembourg is killed, and it was never going to, you know, there wasn't anyone who was going to be able to receive what Lenin was saying.
That's your point, you're right.
So, yeah, I just wanted to make that remark about that, but maybe other people want to talk about the specifics of like the SPD and USPD and Bernard.
I want to go into detail, but let me just say it's pretty simple. And by the way, of course, the Russian Revolution influenced German workers and gave some guidance, you know, what is to be done, whatever the party organization, all of this influenced. So I'm not saying that there's no influence, but it's not the main thing. Basically the Germans were defeated, and the Kaiser and the military handed it over to the reformists, the socialists, the counter-revolutionaries that pose as revolutionaries. And they did get rid of the Kaiser, and they set up a bourgeois republic, got rid of the kingdoms and the princes, and that's what they did so capitalism could move forward. And the socialists were just the handmaidens of the capitalist class that went ahead and ended up murdering the communists. And of course, playing that role, they set themselves up to be murdered by the Nazis themselves. And so this is all that happened, and this happens everywhere in the world. The socialists always play the role of posing as the revolutionaries to mislead the working class, and they end up killing the working class and killing communists. And so, you know, you don't have socialism because you have a bourgeois republic, and they never go beyond that. Show me where they have. They just haven't. And so they play the same role today here in the US and in Europe. Absolutely no. In fact, they play the role so well that after World War II, the CIA funded the Socialist Party in France and everywhere else. And in Japan, the Socialist Party had disappeared. Socialist Party supported German militarism against China and Vietnam and everywhere else. It was only the Communist Party that opposed it, and it became outlawed in 1928. Its leadership lived in exile in Moscow, and when the war was over, they were the most popular party and almost took power, except for U.S. imperialism under MacArthur stopping them. There is no difference in any of this. Doesn't mean communists are perfect, but we know what side we're on, and the other people are pretty false in what they're doing. There was something else, though, that...
Can I ask a question related to that, actually?
Yeah.
So another thing that I wanted to know is, like, so, you know, there's all these examples, though, of fascism coming into power through bourgeois democracy and elections and so forth. Are there examples of what the Social Democrats in Germany wanted to do actually succeeding, though? You know, sort of because they had such a big communist organization,
right.
You know, that if they simply, you know, they could sort of like establish a communist society, you know, through electoral politics. Like, has that ever been done?
They thought they had power, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the SPD thought they, like, in other words, the delegitimization of the military, they thought, of course, they would have to support our socialist demands. In other words, Ebert thought, well, of course, Ludendorff, whether or not he likes it, and he knows he doesn't like it, he's going to have to support whatever reforms we're going to put into the parliament, because he just has no popular support for the war. So whether or not there's a successful use of, I guess, the counter-revolutionaries by the socialists, well, you could say that the Bolsheviks used former Tsarist generals. Like, in other words, there's always this who-whom question, which is that there are going to be conservatives and reactionaries in a revolution. And the point, there might be racists in a revolution, and the point is how to, like, use them, or, right? Like, I mean, there were anti-Semites in the October Revolution, and they thought, who knows, they were stopping world Jewry, whatever they thought that was their understanding of anti-imperialism. And the question is, can you politically render them only useful to you? Right, like, because otherwise, like, I can't force someone besides, I don't know, killing them to stop being, having some prejudice or something like that. So I guess that would be the best example I can think of using something that would be counter-revolutionary to.
No. I'm not speaking kind of generally about counter-revolutionary institutions. I mean specifically parliamentary democracy, or bourgeois democracy. I mean, so that can lead to fascism, as in the case of Italy and Germany, right? Can it lead to communism, right? Can you get to communism and stuff like that by using that bourgeois institution?
You could. Of course you could.
It never has. Yeah. It never has.
But that, what is that? Of course, something can still be possible if it never has. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I mean, that's like Marx. I mean, Marx.
So bound up though with.
Only if you believe, the socialists believe the state is neutral. So all you have to do is elect Bernie Sanders as president and get a majority in the Congress and a majority in the Senate, and then you can begin to make these reforms and change things, which you can up to a point. But when it endangers the capitalist profits and their property, they are going to overthrow it. Chile is the best example of this, and what's happening in Venezuela is another good example. Revolution means that you destroy and dismantle the state and you build a new state. It means the overthrow of one class by another, not the absorption of it. The people in River Oaks down the street, they will not give up their property without killing you first. And they'll use the police to do it or the military to do it. And if they don't have that, they'll pull out a gun and they will fight to the death.
They might be socialist.
Look at what happened after the Paris Commune. You had the capitalists actually getting in line, women included, shooting communards down, women and children.
And the capitalists supported the Paris Commune.
Well, the Paris, okay, that's a different subject. Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, you might have to win them over, like, sorry if I'm interrupting.
Oh, Ryan, just go ahead.
Oh yeah, I guess on that question, I agreed to an extent with Bernard. I mean, I think it's not absurd to consider the possibility of achieving socialism through democratic means. I think it is, of course, possible in kind of a technical sense, but I would agree with Bernard that the relations between the classes are such that the bourgeoisie would never allow that. I think they would necessarily, fight back against an attempt to achieve socialism through democratic means. But I also wanted to go back to your question a little bit, and Bernard and Danny mentioned, how Ludendorff and the German ruling class, used the Social Democrats, the SPD, as kind of a bulwark against Bolshevism, and likewise, we kind of touched on. The reverse was also true, right? The SPD thought that they were using, that they were the ones using the German ruling class, and that they had attained power. And we use this language of the betrayal of the working class by the social democracy and these sorts of things, which I think is a little bit of us in retrospect kind of applying our notions back onto them. With the exception of maybe some figures, I don't know, like Ebert or Noska or someone. I'm not necessarily going to defend them.
What was the hang-up between the Bolsheviks and the German socialists? Do we know?
The German socialists, I think, the Schiedemans, especially, the Kautskys, the Bernsteins.
But they were part of the International, right? The Second International. So anyway.
I don't think that they're trying to undermine this idea of developing, of socialism. I think they are, again, maybe with the exception of some figures like Noska and Ebert and whatnot. But I think, the figures like Schiederman and much more, Kautsky and Bernstein and whatnot are instead, taking an approach of developing socialism out of what they view as being an incremental, gradualist kind of democratic means, which I would argue was going to fail at the time. I think we see that in
was that necessarily
retrospect.
oppositional?
And I also think that that perspective leads them into the opportunist steps that they ultimately take, right? As the social composition of the SPD changes, as the leaders of the SPD and of the trade unions become more and more enmeshed in this notion of this gradual change, it then leads very easily into the opportunist position of defending the gains that you've made so far, right? And of missing that opportunity to then take the next step as the situation develops.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so you see that with the SPD. You see that, and I guess to answer your question a little more, after the, initially the German ruling class hands power in November 1918 to the SPD, as we said, as a kind of bulwark against Bolshevism, and then
Egbert, right?
To Ebert and to Schiederman as chancellor, and then the masses kind of force this government to take on the independent socialists, the USPD, as well. So you have kind of a coalition government of the USPD and the SPD, which really only lasts for about 2 months or something like that. I think it breaks up on this kind of Christmas Day offensive against sections of the kind of revolutionary sections of the military.
That's why the Sparts break, is because of the Christmas uprising.
So
they were in the USPD.
Yeah, the Sparts actually don't break from the USPD until I think New Year's Day 1919 when they formed the KPD.
Well, who attacked who? I don't. This is getting into minutia. I'll go read Wikipedia.
There you go. Yeah. Bernard, you want to say something? Then I have a question.
Okay, on the role of the socialist, it's an interesting question. They have their own beliefs, and they may be ignorant in what its meaning is, or what its outcome is going to be. But there's no doubt that they were not interested in democracy. They were not the Democrats. They were the anti-democrats. The communists were the Democrats because the communists wanted to hand the state over to the working class and allow them to rule. The socialists were there to control the working class. The Judith's goat is what they were, to mislead them and to use the government and to form coalitions with organizations that would suppress.
So you're talking about the Germans,
the German socialists
being representative kinds of democracy versus the more direct democracy
well, they
of the
claim to be
Soviet
the
Union.
they claim to be the Democrats, and the Bolsheviks were not the Democrats.
But yeah, I get you.
But and this fed into Rosa Luxemburg and her arguments, where she was wrong with Lenin. She was totally wrong, and she did get closer to Lenin later on. But the point is
So
that
you
she
mean
was
about splitting with the?
yeah she was wrong on Lenin's on the argument on this subject with Lenin. She was totally wrong, and
On which thing?
On splitting with the Social Democrats. Is what you're
No,
referring to.
not splitting the Social Democrats, but on the nature of the state, of our criticisms of the Bolshevik Party not being Democrat. She had, she had tendencies of bourgeois democratic thinking, but it's not democracy. The American Revolution promised bourgeois democracy, fraternity, freedom, voting
Equality.
rights, but it didn't give it to anyone except a very small group of people. And since then, it's only been expanded because the working class has fought against the capitalist class and forced them to give them something. And then the next election, the Republicans win, or reactionary Democrats, and they take it back. There are no democratic rights that are permanent under capitalism. It is not a democratic system. It is the dictatorship of the capitalist class, of the bourgeoisie. They have democracy among themselves, and it's only for them. Communists fight for democracy for the 160 million members of the working class in this country. And when we take over, yeah, it's going to be very undemocratic for the petty bourgeoisie and the people that support the bourgeoisie. Rush Limbaugh, you're never going to hear him again on the radio. Never. You're never going to hear Hannity. Your Fox News will no longer exist. By the way, it's not some independent thing. It's an arm of the state. So is CNN, so is MSNBC. These are not free, independent things. These are arms of propaganda of the 1% that keep us enslaved. And so communists fight to get rid of that. So when we have state-sponsored radio, it's state-sponsored by the working class. You know, China has almost 90 million members in the Communist Party. The overwhelming majority are working class. Most of the leaders in the Communist Party are engineers and stuff like this, just like it was in the Soviet Party. This is what it looks like. Now, what stage of socialism? Is it perfect socialism? No. The leadership of the Communist Party says they're at a very low level of socialism, and they recognize there's going to be more democratic reforms as production increases, and they don't have to worry about the intrusion of bourgeois culture, bourgeois, counter-revolution in China. Right now, China's still too weak. So yes, there is less democratic rights for the working class, but that's decided by the working class to defend the general population and the state against U.S. imperialism. And they've already said that will change by around 2050. They're saying they're hoping to reach a stage of development of socialism where they can eliminate that. But people really confuse this question of democracy. You know,
I mean, like this is kind of an abstract point, though. But it sounds like you're saying that basically, when you finally have communism, right, then it's sort of the realization essentially of democracy, like in the sense of kind of voting rights and all this stuff, right now.
It's totally opposite.
Yeah.
You can only have democracy. Democracy is a tool of oppression by one class by another. It's a rule of the majority or the rule of the minority.
No, I understand the class struggle part, though.
Yeah.
But what's the ideal then? Sort of like get rid of the class interest and be truly representative? Is that what you're saying? Like the communism would be like?
But China is a socialist state. It's not a communist state. Under communism, democracy disappears because you don't have a state. It's a tool of the state of oppression. You don't have oppression because you no longer have classes. People see, and this is what people don't. And Lenin talks about it quite extensively of what democracy is and what its nature is, and it's really confused to a lot of people here in the United States.
So
and they mix it up with freedom.
Right.
I mean, you're not going to have freedom under socialism either. Freedom is the lack of necessity. That will never happen until you get communism, where there is no state. In a sense, we go back to prehistory, to the primitive commune of the clans, where there was equality, there was no special armed bodies of men and women, there was no organized religion, there was no marriage, etc., except on a much higher level where there's enough for everyone and you're not living on the edge of starvation.
So then, at the very end of this whole schema, then there would be sort of no more state and no more electoral politics too.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
Wouldn't be any of that.
That's what I wanted to know.
No need for it.
I have a question. Could anybody speak to the impact of the failure of the German Revolution on Marxist thought, on Marxism? If any?
Well, I'll give my view, but this might be I would say that there were all the Marxisms kind of came out of this period, right? In other words, we get left communism in this period. We get what I think is something Stalinism we get in this period. This eventually we're going to have Euro-communism, we're going to have Maoism. So I think, what happened in World War I was a civil war in Marxism, right? Like, in other words, the social chauvinists basically launched a war on the international, and they created the condition for a split that Lenin followed through on. And I think a lot of what we still deal with today are kind of remnants of that break. In other words, when I hear people talk about socialist and communist, in Marx's time, he just identified them as the same thing. Right? He just, in his letter to Ruga, 1843, he just kind of says, yeah, it's the socialist, the communist, it's Proudhon, right? I mean, he's putting all sorts of things all together, and he's just saying this is a general symptom of now. Now people talk about socialists and social democrats, or they talk about socialists and communists, and this is because we're still kind of living with this legacy of this, like Lenin gambled, okay, we're going to split the international, and that's going to lead to a world revolution. He says there's like a necessity to it, that literally, in order to pick up on the revolutionary continuity in the Second International, I have to split it. Right? The idea of the Third International is not that it was communism as opposed to socialism, but that it was going to achieve the aims of the Second International, that they were going to redeem the founding of it. So I think one of the legacies today is we have like 5 million different kinds of Marxisms. And part of that, I think, goes back to my opening remarks about history, where I think everybody treats the German Revolution like it's like they're plumbers and they know where the leak is and they fixed it. And it's just like, oh, well, we learned from history. We did the science and we now know. And that was where the hole is. And now I know, don't be in a party, be in a party. Smash the state, go to the parliament. There's like a debate right now happening between kind of Jacobin and Marxist center over like this parliamentarian thing, right? I think Eric Blanc is going to be here in Houston very soon, in May, in fact. And he's part of this, like, was Kautsky right? Do you go to the parliament? Do we have to go to the parliament in the U.S.? And so these things, they continue happening again and again. So I think, I don't know, I wanted to end with the Socrates thing because I want to make us feel that we're not so sure about the answer to the German Revolution. And yeah, because I think even the ostensible answers reproduce a problem that was not dealt with under the guise of some kind of progress.
Well, and this is kind of what Lenin recognizes during that period, right? That the necessity of the Revolutionary Party is not just for the struggle against the bourgeoisie, but for the struggle to win the wider working class against other socialisms.
Yeah.
So I think that is one kind of key aspect that comes out of this. I agree with Danny. What I would say is ultimately the kind of degeneration of the international revolution. Does throw up that all of these other, all of these kind of competing ideas of Marxism. Danny listed a lot of them. But yeah, so it's kind of a really fundamental shift from what had been kind of a much more unified, socialism in the Second International. And when Lenin recognizes this need for a split into the Third International, I think it was a necessary split, but it does kind of open now this Pandora's box of, socialisms that are in many ways competing against each other.
I think the lesson from the failed German Revolution was that you can't trust the socialist. I mean, that's the first thing, and it's not just in Germany, but everywhere they seem to put themselves up as the champion of the working class against communists because they're democratic, and the communists are a centralized state that's not democratic or something. And I think that's the one lesson, and that has not changed. That still exists today. And I think, I don't think that the German Revolution, the failure, led to all these different forms of Marxism. We had different forms of Marxism under Marx, utopian socialism, all kinds of stuff. So no, and the breakup of the First International, of the Second International, was correct thing to do. I think Lenin was correct in that because, again, you can't stay in an international with traitors. Even DSA has had to drop out of the Socialist International because they've changed from a totally anti-communist organization to one that's in motion. Where, I don't know, but it's away from where they were. And so even they had to drop out of an organization that is known for its... They hate communists more than they hate capitalists. This is the problem. with a lot of the socialist or the regular socialist organizations, at least in their actions. It doesn't matter what they promise. They never give what they promise. Just because I promise you liberty and the rights to run things doesn't mean I'm going to give them to you. They never have. Never have. They've done just the opposite. So I think that there's always been differences of Marxism, interpretations, and I think there always will be. What really matters is who grabs state power, who's successful. And those are the people that you study from, not the failures. China, Vietnam, Cuba, these are the people, look at them and look at how they're developing, realizing that you can't compare Cuba to the United States, but compare it to El Salvador or Guatemala or Mexico, and there is no comparison. That's the success of socialism, whether you want to call it Stalinism or what, that's the success. You know, and that's what we build on. And we build and we make things better. We don't say that there's not progress in human history. There is progress. We have to believe that we build on the past and things are getting better, that life gets better, that our understanding gets better. If we don't believe that, then we don't believe in, I think we don't believe in science, and that we might as well just give up. And, you know, so that's just my view on that.
I just want to clarify that, you know, what I'm saying is not that, the distinction I'm trying to make is not that, you know, I'm not disagreeing with you that we should, and saying that we should trust social democrats. I'm saying, you know, the distinction is we shouldn't trust social democrats not because they're evil or because they're, you know, because this is somehow a good versus, you know, bad story necessarily. You know, it's the bourgeoisie is ultimately the class enemy. We can't trust social democrats because social democracy is a tendency towards opportunism, and that's somewhat distinct from saying, you know, that at its outset it is intending on opportunism. I guess that's kind of, and maybe that's too. I think that's an important point because I think we need to understand the you know, the basis behind this if we are going to do, you know, what Lenin you know, says and win over the working class to our position as revolutionaries. So that's the distinction I'm trying to draw, which is you know, I agree with you on the fundamental that yeah, we can't trust social democrats to carry out the revolutionary project.
Let's respond really quickly sort of to the characterization of Vietnamese communism there. Like, so during the war, the interesting thing was you had sort of the Communist Party forced to adopt something that looked actually kind of similar to council democracy, right? To fight against the Americans, you had to have the sort of decentralized, sort of administrative, military, and system of production as well. But that was always against their sort of Leninist centralist tendencies. So of course, like once the war was over, you're like, well, that was a, you know, just temporary sort of emergency measure. We got rid of that system and sort of had a normal top-down sort of like state-planned economy. The goal, of course, for the Communist Party was ultimately for the state to wither away, right? But now it's a fully developed capitalist state, though, you know, and it's done sort of like largely what China's been able to do, sort of raise all these people out of poverty. But it's done so at the cost now, I think, of permanently postponing the moment that when the state's going to wither. I mean, that's not going to happen anytime soon, probably not, you know. So then there's a question still, like, of whether I think, that, you know, like sort of like having the goal of the state sort of withering away at the very end of history, though, is actually going to happen, though, instead of sort of looking at something like these failed experiments, though, like in council democracy, is maybe not just being sort of a means towards something else, though, but some other sort of form of organization that's been looked at as kind of a transitional phase. But
well, yeah, I would agree with you that I don't think we can see the withering away of the state in China or Vietnam or something, or somewhere like that, without a political revolution of the working class in those countries to overthrow the bureaucratic, you know, form that exists there now. You know, maybe we would disagree over the cause of that being the Leninist form of the party, but I would say that you know, I think that it has put off the withering away of the state, and that a second, you know, revolution, a political revolution, is necessary in order to, you know, ultimately achieve the conditions for the withering away of the state.
So there's one other part of that story that I forgot to mention, right? So you know, like so in China prior to sort of the modern period, right, you had this political administration where there was 20,000 mandarins, right, that governed the whole of China, right? So in Vietnam, when the French took over and established the bureaucratic state, though, it took sort of 56,000 people and stuff, though, just to sort of deal with that colony that was the size of a single province of China, though. And then when the Communist Revolution happened, of course, though, the bureaucracy just sort of ballooned after that, right? To the point where all these revolutionaries were saying, you know, why did we go to the all the effort to overthrow the state, though, just to be able to establish like a bureaucratic system that's more parasitic than that of the colonial government?
Well, I would say that, you know, first off, on the question of socialism going into communism, that's something that can't happen, really, until you have worldwide revolution. For the state to wither away, it means armed bodies of men. It means your secret police disappearing. How can you do that when U.S. imperialism or British imperialism exists? So the state has to be strong. And a bureaucracy, well, when you have a modern government, you have a bureaucracy. You had a bureaucracy in ancient China, too. It was a huge bureaucracy. And you still have, it doesn't mean that the state, a strong state, isn't going to have a strong bureaucracy. But there's a difference between people that are bureaucrats that work for the state in the interest of the dictatorship of the proletariat, carrying out state functions, and people that are doing it that aren't doing it for the good of the state or for the working class. You're talking about corrupt bureaucrats, and they're in all socialist states. Lenin warned about it in the Soviet state. In fact, he said that when we go into NEP, the main danger is going to be that of bribery. He's talking about Communist Party members, not people outside the Communist Party, that could be bribed by capitalists, etc. And this is, of course, what happened in the Soviet Union. Its demise has nothing to do with Stalinism, I don't think, at all. You know, I mean, Trotsky was quite a bureaucrat himself, and you know, if you look at some of the stuff he did. But again, I'm not attacking Trotsky. I think Trotsky played a good role in the Russian Revolution by and large, and you know, I don't think he was an agent of Nazism or any nonsense like that. But he was wrong. He was wrong on the development. He was wrong, and that's why he lost, because he was wrong, I think.
I don't think it is. Sorry.
Sorry, I just want to say three things. I guess in terms of helping who were you helping? I mean, the imperialist states helped the working class. In fact, that was the whole justification for everything they were doing, which is that we need to export the crisis in order to protect our working class. In other words, one of the ways that Rosa Luxemburg's biographer put it, J.P. Nettle, was that imperialism was a domestic issue. And it was actually an issue of people demanding reforms at home. So I don't think it's who are you helping in any kind of direct sense, because you can say there's a difference between a working class interest and a proletarian interest. I mean, the working class has an interest in higher wages and better job security, but that could be in direct contradistinction to overthrowing wage labor altogether. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say in terms of Stalinism is the issue is not bureaucracy so much as it was the capitulation to the failure of the German Revolution. It was an accommodation. So it was more like it was an opportunism thing. Because the bureaucracy part, you know, in Trotsky's critique of the Soviet Union, he doesn't have a problem with the fact that it's bureaucratic. And you even mentioned, because Lenin has this little critique of Trotsky being too bureaucratic, the problem is they were pretending like it wasn't bureaucratic. They were saying, no, it's the proletarian power. In other words, he wanted them to call a spade and kind of be more clear and upfront about it in that sense. And then finally, in terms of science, I think, this is my interpretation, I think that there might even be a little despair. In other words, I think it's frightening to think maybe in the 20th century that we maybe didn't learn anything. That just sounds nihilistic. And so I think what's being put in for science is like, you have to be optimistic, of course, but that optimism doesn't have to say, therefore, we've made progress. It just is saying that there are potentials in society. So I don't think it has to be, you have to treat it like we're learning all the time. Certainly people feel compelled to treat the 20th century like we're learning all the time. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to make sense of. But, you know, Marx never felt like he had to say that. He never had to say, well, obviously people are learning all the time. Or Lenin never felt like he had to say that. And that's because they thought capitalism was actually a regression in society. It wasn't that, it's some people are getting the benefits and other people are not, but that literally they were falling below the American Revolution, that they were falling below the French Revolution. That, Marx called the bourgeoisie of his time vulgar bourgeoisie, that they weren't even bourgeois, that John Stuart Mill wasn't even his father, James Mill. He was worse, right? He's like not even up to the bourgeois horizon. And I think this goes back to the question of democracy, which is the whole point was that, the reason why the communists have to achieve democracy is because it kind of never has been achieved. And that wasn't necessarily the result of the conspiracy, it was just that it fell into contradiction in its development. Democracy can be constituted by capital or labor.
Or maybe the question is sort of whether that's even achievable to begin with, right? Because of course what happens after the German Revolution is you have sort of this parliamentary state that's completely operative. Like there's far too many parties though, and suddenly everyone becomes completely pessimistic about democracy itself though, right? So.
No, you guys are sort of pessimistic, I think, about it all. I think we have a great future. I think we're going to win. And I have total confidence in the working class, including our comrades in other countries where they have state power. And, there's setbacks, obviously, but history advances. And, capitalism was a necessary advancement and development that took place. Capitalism allowed production of food and necessities for people to where we have it for everyone. It's because of the profit motive that it's not evenly distributed. But capitalism built that base. Without capitalism, you couldn't have socialism. That's why socialism comes out of capitalism. All it does is it takes the production of all of this that we have around us that was scarcity in the past. People didn't have it. Only a few people had it under feudalism, and even fewer had it under slave societies. But capitalism has led to this advancement at terrible cost. But it also created the working class, which will end up overthrowing it. And all it means is when we take over, we're going to take all of this and we're going to distribute it to where people don't have to live in poverty, don't have to live in the streets. There's never an excuse that there's not enough food. There's enough. It's just people can't get hold of it. There's enough medicine for everybody. That's all socialism does. That's what the dictatorship of the proletariat does. It just ensures that everything created under capitalism is democratically distributed to people instead of it being controlled by profit. I'm not going to give you this because you don't have enough to pay for it, or I'm going to raise this medicine that'll save your life. This is the whole fight over Medicare and everything else. I'm very optimistic. We can now build real socialism because we have the means to do it for everybody. Isn't that what it's about? Not for the few, but for the many. Before, in history, you could never have it for everybody because you didn't have enough production of food and clothing and everything else. Today we have it, thanks to capitalism. But now it's outlived its usefulness. It's outlived it because of the profit motive. It stops these things from being distributed that it makes because it only distributes it based on profit, not on need. It's a question of people before profits or profits before people. So I'm very optimistic. I think everything is great. And it's going to get better. But we got to get rid of Trump and the far right. And then we have to go against monopoly capital in the next stage. Everything is a stage. You don't jump. So you have to figure out what stage. We're not in a pre-revolutionary stage. There's no mass revolutionary party in this country. And we're all trying to fight to influence people, and so it's a struggle. And in the end, we can debate all day, but in the end, it's who wins. We're the people that were right, and everything. They were the smarter people. They had the objective conditions behind them to win. Victory in battle isn't just done because you have a smarter general. It's done because of the productive power of that country, what it can produce, and its economy and other things. So that's how we have to look at this whole change in history and advancement towards socialism. And then one day, way in the future, because the state will not disappear until all capitalists have been destroyed, then the states will begin to disappear. And that'll be hundreds of years after capitalism is gone. And people that are born of capitalist parents don't think anymore, I'm going to get my factory back. That conception will cease to exist. Just like the idea of private property under primitive communism in prehistory did not exist. The concept of an armed bodies of men and women, of the state, did not exist. The concept of religion did not exist. They couldn't think of it because they hadn't developed, because the objective productive conditions were not there that led to that development. I mean, that's how our minds work, right? Through interaction with objective conditions. And as advance, we advance. We're not the same people that the ancient Romans were. If you brought an ancient Roman back here today, they would have problem even understanding reality because everything was the gods. And it was just, it's hard for us to even understand. You know, it's just a different world that we live in. And socialism will be different. And communism, it's hard to imagine. People that, you know, where you work for maybe a couple hours a day of even that. And no state, no police, no prisons. That's communism. Under socialism, you know, the DSA is wrong. There are going to be prisons under socialism because there's still people that are going to murder people and rob. And of course, we have to have a place for our friends in River Oaks.
Are there any more questions from the audience? No. Well, how do we feel about wrapping up?
I have to wrap up actually.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
born, so.
Oh, yeah, understood. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you, panelists. Thank you so much. Very much appreciated.
Anybody want to go get dinner?
Keep me updated. Go to work.